record. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We have been running these monthly roundtables for over a year now, and they arose initially because we were going to be running a TAG US session about pedagogy in 2020, and obviously for obvious reasons that didn't happen. So Karina and I thought we would sort of have a go at just bringing together the people that we knew and opening up sort of conversations about teaching and learning online. And then we've sort of opened it up to whoever wants to join us, and we've covered some really fascinating subjects over the last year, sort of everything from how you might teach practical archaeology in an online arena to a whole series of subjects that are more situated within the kind of sociopolitics of archaeological practice and teaching and learning, so looking at decolonizing and indigenous knowledges, and today we're going to be looking at the issue of harassment within teaching and learning in archaeology. So that's the kind of background to what we've been doing and where today's session is. I know quite a lot of people have joined us today who maybe haven't been to one of these before, so thank you very much for joining us. Karina, I'll hand over to you for...
Yeah, so these are run as non-judgmental safe spaces. So we just ask everyone to be respectful of each other, to treat anything that they hear in confidence, but also be mindful of what you're sharing, especially with a large group of people. We do record the beginning part of a session. So again, if you'd rather not be recorded, do turn your camera off. Feel free to change your name if you need to. And feel free to type in the chat. As we go along, we've got our format is we've got 3 speakers who will hear 10 minutes from each roughly, and then we'll have a Q&A for all of them collectively. We'll then divide us out into breakout rooms to discuss main challenges and ways forward to share good practice, and then we'll bring everyone back together to feedback from the groups. So that's how we'll run. Most people are aware of Zoom etiquette by now, generally keeping yourself on mute unless you want to say something. If you do want to speak, either type in the chat or raise your hand. With multiple people now, if you feel like you're not getting listened to, we're quite laid back and we're quite informal. You can just unmute and talk, and that's fine. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, I think that's it for our general introduction. So just thank everyone for coming. We've got people from around the globe today, and we were just saying it's quite difficult to say we're excited by the topic, because in an ideal world we wouldn't need to talk about this topic, but we do realise it's an important one, and we're encouraged that so many people are coming together to discuss the inspiring work of our speakers and think about where we need to go next in the discipline. So with that in mind, I think we will hand over to our first speaker. We're really delighted that Kathleen Sterling can join us. Kathleen, I'm gonna we keep this quite informal and laid back, so I'll head straight over to Kathleen. Really pleased you can join us. Kathleen's obviously from Binghamton University, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Thank you, Hannah and Karina, for inviting me. And I think the tremendous response that this roundtable has received says a lot about the need for these discussions and actions to prevent harassment in our discipline. I'm speaking to you today from Binghamton University, which is located on the unceded land of the Onondaga, a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who maintain a contemporary presence on this land. My remarks today take a broad approach to the idea of pedagogy. So this not only includes what we do in the classroom, but our informal interactions in our departments, universities, in the field, and the structures and policies that we often don't notice until we collide with them, or and that as we advance in our careers, we may have more power to affect one way or another. In April, I gave a presentation at the presidential session at the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting that focused on equity and harassment in archaeology. I don't want to repeat what I said then, but to build on that. So I'll just give a really brief summary of what I talked about before I move ahead. So I talked about equity issues in academic archaeology, specifically about the ways in which we think about efforts to increase diversity, thought of broadly, so in terms of gender, race, class, ability, disability, etc. Primarily focuses on individuals, or it's a very passive idea of how we can increase. Rather than looking at the systems that serve as impediments or ways of gatekeeping or pushing people out of the discipline. So I critiqued two common metaphors, the leaky pipeline and the glass ceiling. So the leaky pipeline is one of these passive metaphors. So when people refer to this, they argue that the lack of diversity in the discipline is an issue of there not being enough people sort of in the waiting room to come in, and that we just need to wait, and that's going to change over time. But it doesn't really consider how people get interested in coming into the discipline to begin with, or how the ways in which we teach, mentor the climate of the discipline or the university can lead people to leave early, or that some people might be deliberately pushed out. And then the glass ceiling metaphor is again about individuals. It is about the extraordinary individuals who break invisible barriers that don't actually exist for everyone. And then once the barrier is broken, it just remains broken for everyone. So at that point, anyone in a less powerful position who doesn't succeed, it's their fault because that barrier has been broken and we don't have to do anything, we don't have to change the system. So my argument was that these really common metaphors are harmful to our ability to work toward equity in academic archaeology. And instead, I suggested using a framework described by sociologist Patricia Hill Collins in her book, Black Feminist Thought. This framework is the matrix of domination, and it looks at multiple sites and scales of inequity and oppression. So I'll describe the basics of the matrix of domination. And then I'm going to provide some cases where students experienced harassment in pedagogical settings, and use one of them as an example of how we might apply the matrix of domination to analyze the situation and to act on it. And so, you know, just, I don't think there's anything that requires a really strong content or trigger warning in this, but there will be some discussion primarily of racist discrimination and some sexual discrimination as well. So, and And I will also warn you that I don't have answers, that this is still very much a work in progress. And at least for the situation that I'm directly involved in, is still an issue that we're very much working through in our department. Okay, so the matrix of domination is very simple on its face. And in terms of vocabulary, I'm going to talk about identities that are dominant or minoritized. And, while these are binary terms, they can be used intersectionally, and they are situational identities. So dominant identities are those that are typically the more powerful, and minoritized are those that typically have less power. This has nothing to do with numbers. For example, people who identify as women or girls are actually in the numerical majority, but in most situations are less powerful, even if some individuals do quite well. So Collins identifies 4 major domains under which oppression operates. And in all of these, dominant groups have disproportionate power and benefits, or you might think of it that they are harmed the least by these systems. So the 4 domains are structural, disciplinary, hegemonic, and interpersonal. The top 2 domains are very strongly linked to each other, and the bottom 2 are very strongly linked. It's harder for most of us to have impact on the left 2 domains, and usually a bit easier to have some influence or impact on the right 2. And the bottom 2 domains influence what happens in the top 2, sometimes in subtle or surprising ways, especially since we're often accustomed to thinking about power operating in a top-down fashion. So some examples. The structural domain is vast and touches many aspects of our daily lives. And I'm going to talk about things from primarily US perspective, and I'll try to explain some of the things that may not apply internationally briefly, but I'm happy to answer questions about some of the specifics after. So the structural domain is rooted in history, and major change is often difficult and time consuming, and smaller changes can be easier and occur frequently, but sometimes these things can change rather quickly. So we see this with laws, policies. So for universities, Title IX legislation, which in the United States is meant to guarantee equal opportunity in education regardless of sex. Affirmative action policies, which are typically in universities or in businesses where there's an effort to increase diversity with policy backing to it, tenure and promotion guidelines at universities, but also the lack of laws or official policies to protect minoritized people. The disciplinary domain interprets and executes the structural domain. So taking the Title IX laws that are written on the books, but then you have a transition from a President Trump to a President Biden that results in a change in how that law is interpreted. And so just today, for example, the Biden administration announced that they would be interpreting Title IX to include trans people as being eligible for protection against discrimination on the basis of sex, which is a complete turnaround from the previous administration. So laws and policies have some flexibility in them, which is necessary and important so that we can do things like that we can interpret things for the better, but it can also open up some doors that allow for discrimination. So we have to be careful about that as well. We also have a lot of arguments going on in universities in the United States now, and I see that that's spreading to Europe, particularly to the UK and to France, about teaching critical race theory, and some people trying to ban that without really understanding what it is. So that would be one example. Another really important example for faculty is how teaching is evaluated and the role that that plays in promotion and tenure. Moving to the hegemonic domain, it's important because we're all products of our cultures, and our students and future colleagues are as well. And this domain is sometimes or I would say oftentimes, the least visible. This is where we form some of our most deeply held beliefs about how the world works, and we often don't question these notions until they clash with something in our lives. It's the sort of thing that everybody knows. So some examples would be how archaeology privileges masculinist gender performance in arenas such as dress, language, drinking. Other examples include pregnancy discrimination, considering some people to belong to special interest groups rather than being sort of neutral observers of the world, and the ways in which we, at least in the United States, center whiteness. And then lastly, the interpersonal domain is the area that usually gets the most attention, and it's usually also the easiest to see and to interact with. It is very important to deal with this arena, but lots of times what we do in this arena is kind of tinkering around the edges, and hopefully in many situations we are achieving justice or supporting people, but in other situations we're just not leading to change in the systems that allow for this interpersonal experience of oppression to happen. So some of the examples are the way that Title IX cases at universities end up with the university being protected, but the victim not feeling like they received justice. So sexual assault and harassment are in this domain, and our assault in some ways is easier to deal with because there are laws, but there are a lot of hurdles as well. Am I coming up on 10 minutes?
Yeah, sorry, it's just over. It goes really quick, doesn't it? Sorry, Kathleen.
It really does. Sorry, I wanted to just give a brief example. I'll skip over the other contextual ones here, and I'll just focus on this last example with like a minute. So this is the example that I'm dealing with right now in our department. And this is a bystander training that we organized for our graduate students in preparation for going back into the field after a couple of years of not being able to do so. So we asked a coordinator from the 20 to 1 program, which is a nationally recognized bystander intervention program, that's based on peer education and is meant to create empathy and action. And we did a lot of prep work, but our graduate students who went through this training felt, many of them felt like they were being discriminated against in it. So those students who were non-binary, for example, were made to choose a binary category, male or female, and it was structured around assumptions of men as perpetrators and women as victims that didn't get to the kinds of nuance that our students were looking for, and that race and other aspects of identity, students felt like they were being deliberately asked to exclude those. So I'm currently in a lot of meetings back and forth trying to figure out how we can move forward with this, because the university is not going to stop using this program. So how can we make it better? And I wish that I had a little bit more time to go into the details, but I don't want to take away from my colleagues. So I will just stop there for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kath. That was brilliant. Really interesting to hear about that. I think we might have forgotten to say that what we'll do is we'll have all of the papers, and then after we've had each of the 3 papers, we'll have the questions. That's what we planned, wasn't it, Karina? I'm not completely forgetting.
We'll save up all the questions and have them after.
Well, I think we might have forgotten to say that at the start, but if people are watching and have a question for Kathleen and would like to ask, you can always put it in the chat, or you can sort of save it till the end of the papers and we'll have a bit of space for questions. Although Suzanne's asked if you can share the link to the training group for the academic setting. That's in the, I'll just flag that up now so it doesn't get lost within the chat. Thank you so much, that was brilliant. So we'll move on to our next speaker now. So we're really lucky to have Barbara Voss joining us today. I was just thinking we should whilst you're speaking, we'll put the links to your 2 recent papers in the chat so that people can access those. But probably by rabbiting on about them, that's a spoiler alert, so as it were. So I'll hand over to you, Barb, and pass on. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Let me just get the presentation going. And here we go. Is that showing up correctly? Great. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much. And I want to start by just thanking Kath as well for a really wonderful presentation. It is really exciting to be part of this discussion, and particularly to have this dialogue between the 3 of us on the panel. You know, this is the first time the 3 of us have presented together. So there's a lot of sparking already in my brain, a lot of questions I have for Kath, and I'm sure I will have for Lewis as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is the process that I went through in designing workshops on preventing harassment in archaeology. And I should say in this case, using archaeology as a springboard, I have given 4 of these workshops so far. I have more scheduled for next year. And these have been primarily given within my home institution, Stanford University, in the wake of the release of the articles that were mentioned. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm both doing this work from and also living on the land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I also want to acknowledge that my university was founded through profit extracted from Chinese railroad workers and other workers in the Stanford enterprises. And I'm very, I want to acknowledge my responsibility to continue to discuss these and related injustices in my research and my teaching. As was mentioned, the workshops I'm going to talk about today came out of this 2-article series that I published in March 2021 on cultures of harassment in archaeology. Both articles are published open access in American Antiquity, and there's a general link to the journal there, and it's great to know the specific links will come up in the chat. I also want to let people know that a Spanish translation of both articles is in process and will be released through Latin American Antiquity later in 2021. And those will also be released open access. And one of the purposes of prioritizing open access for these articles was exactly to make them available for workshops and teaching at no cost. So I'm going to launch into the workshop process. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is the pre-planning we did, the workshop format. I'm going to give you a sample of some of the presentation that was part of the workshop, and then I'm going to end by talking about the post-workshop actions that are part of that whole structure. And part of my goal in doing this is daylighting the background labor and collaboration that goes into developing and implementing these kinds of programs. So this first slide just talks about pre-workshop planning, all the things that we have done leading up to the workshop itself to ensure that the workshops are safe, that they are effective, and that they're conducted in a way that's supportive of the participants. One of the most important things, and this was a bottom line for me, was meeting with the leadership of the organization where the workshop was to be held, whether that was a department or a program or an administrative group, to confirm that the workshop is being held as part of a commitment to actually implement changes in the organization, policy structures, and culture. So this is not window dressing. This is actually part of that the leadership of the organization that requested the workshop recognizes that this is part of a process of transformation, not just a one-off event. Consulting with relevant university offices to ensure compliance with institutional policies and state law. For example, the term training in California has legal meaning, so we refer to these as workshops rather than trainings for specific reasons. We conducted listening sessions with student leaders and other vulnerable members of the group that the workshop was going to be presented to identify key priorities for workshop format and content and make sure that the workshop design was centered on their needs. Identify support and resources, and this I think is critically important, live time and follow-up emotional support and counseling. One group that I'll be mentioning and that you'll see on many of the slides is RAIN, the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. It's a US-based organization, but it offers free 24/7 support by chat and phone in both English and Spanish, and it's available to people around the world. And you'll see that info pop up on these screens throughout my presentation. We also wanted to provide clear information about reporting options and procedures so that if people had an experience that they wanted to report, they knew what the options were. And then we also developed and identified and disseminated community standards prior to the workshop itself. We emphasize that these workshops are not confidential or therapeutic spaces. We provided a content advisory and also provided parameters about discussing harassment. The phrase that one of the counselors we worked with mentioned was share headlines, not details, that in a group non-confidential space, it's appropriate to share broad descriptions, but to not go into specific details of either people's own experiences or things they're aware of or have witnessed. The workshop format itself is actually a little similar to what we're doing today. There's a short introduction and then a more substantial presentation that provides background information, a stretch break, which we built in on purpose to give people time to step away, integrate the content they've received, move their bodies, take deep breaths, regroup, decide if they want to continue with the discussion, decide if they want to step away at that point. And then move into facilitated discussion, which has been facilitated in two sections. The first, comments and questions about the presentation content. And then the second are basically discussing ideas about actions we can take in the community or institution where the workshop is being held to prevent future harassment. And then it closes with a wrap-up period where first there's an opening for participants to contribute any thoughts they haven't yet shared on a group level, and then a reminder of confidential resources for support and of reporting channels. So I'm going to just give you a sample of the presentation now. Basically, the presentation itself is structured around three topics. What is harassment? What do we know about harassment in archaeology? And how can harassment be prevented? In the first section, what is harassment? Basically, the focus here is on creating a group, kind of group, not consensus, but at least a dialogue about what harassment is. One thing I emphasize in this section is that we're not talking about legal definitions of harassment because that changes by jurisdiction and by setting. We're talking about basically pervasive power behaviors that convey hostility, exclusion, objectification, or second-class status based on the perceived identity of the person being targeted. We talk about intersectionality and the ways in which social categorizations are interconnected and provide overlapping or amplification of discrimination or disadvantaged. And then we also situate harassment within other forms of abuses of power at school or work. Harassment is both interpersonal and identity-based. Discrimination is identity-based, but it is not interpersonal, is not necessarily interpersonal, though it can be. And bullying is interpersonal, but it is not necessarily identity-based. And this is a moment in the workshop to talk about, why does it matter that we have this term called harassment? Is it a useful term? And what might be some of the limitations of using a term called harassment in relationship to these other terms, such as discrimination and bullying? I also want to mention, I know I'm going through this really quickly, but my purpose is to give you a sampling, not to give you the full presentation, so bear with me. The second section, what do we know about harassment in archaeology, basically summarizes the material from the first article documenting cultures of harassment in archaeology. This is the opening slide, which talks about the numbers, emphasizing the high prevalence of harassment in archaeology affecting both men and women, but also emphasizing that the numbers are not the only thing. As Doug Rox McQueen says, even if we only had 1%, it is too high a number. Other slides in this section talk about factors known to increase risk of harassment, and that in particular talks about intersectionality and the lack of data about the effect of harassment on queer and non-binary folk, patterns of harassment as learned behavior. Third section talks about how harassment can be prevented, and this summarizes the second article that I published, Disrupting Cultures of Harassment in Archaeology, and it introduces two evidence-based interventions from public health models. The first of these, the sociocultural model, and the second one, public health models. Trauma-informed care. And the trauma-informed care part is really, I think, the heart of the presentation because it introduces an ethic of care into workplaces that are often not structured around the concept of care. And so unpacking this concept of care and thinking about an ethics of care and how that might interface with issues of trauma in a disciplinary population where the majority of women identified archaeologists and a very significant plurality of men identified archaeologists have experienced harassment and physical abuse. That thinking about trauma as part of the culture of our professional community is really a huge mind shift for many of the workshop attendees. And so this is something we spend a lot of time on. There's more content, and then similar to what Kath was doing in her presentation, we then go through some examples of evidence-based interventions, their potential impacts, their potential drawbacks. I mentioned that then we take a stretch break. We get a lot of positive feedback on the animal images. I think that it's really important to remember that this is a really hard conversation for a lot of people, and interjecting images of joy and comfort can really go a long way towards helping people integrate what they're experiencing and have a mental break from the stress of discussing an issue that may be very personally traumatic for some, or that people may have secondary trauma around. And then we go into facilitated discussion and wrap up. And I mentioned that already earlier, first giving time for questions or comments about the presentation, and then moving into really a community discussion of what are the actions we can take as a community to begin to change the tide around harassment in archaeology and allied fields. The final thing that I'm going to mention is the post-workshop work, and this is just as much, if not more, work than the workshop itself. Immediately after each workshop, we hold a debrief about half an hour after a short break with the organizers and facilitators. We do individual check-ins to ensure that care and support is shown to leaders of the workshop, not just participants. We discuss whether any of us want to follow up with professional support or peer support as a result of our experiences facilitating the workshop, so that We're supporting each other in resourcing inwards as well as resourcing outwards. We identify and discuss anything that requires immediate action. For example, I'm what's called a responsible employee in California, which means that if a participant disclosed that they are currently being harassed, I have a legal obligation to report that. We disclose that information up front, but we discuss whether anything came up that requires action on our part, either legally or in other ways. And then we, as a group, summarize the key action items that emerge from the discussion and prepare for the next phase, which is the post-workshop meeting with organization leadership. We've set the groundwork for this before the workshop occurred. The leadership knows that we're going to come back and say, okay, here are the key actions that the participants in the workshop suggested would be taken. And our role in that post-workshop meeting is really just to be a quiet but forceful presence of accountability for organization leadership, to discuss the key actions, to ask them to assign a schedule, and to assign responsibility for how those actions will be followed through. I'll just wrap up by saying we're early in this process. As I said, I've done 4 workshops at Stanford. I've got several more scheduled for the fall. We are branching out beyond archaeology. Using archaeology as a case study, but bringing it to other disciplines that have similar structures or similar issues. It's too soon to know whether there's real structural change that's going to occur as a result of this. But the initial kind of organization level responses have been very positive, and already some departments and programs have changed policies or implemented processes for supporting students and other vulnerable members of the community. So I'm optimistic that there's some good that may come out of it, but I also want to be realistic about the limitations of this kind of work, because as Kath so eloquently outlined, there are structural forces that are beyond individual action at times. And so I want to always contextualize this kind of interpersonal workshop within that broader set of limitations. So thank you so much. I really appreciate being part of this workshop, and now I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is, what have you got on my screen? Lewis Borck. So thank you for joining us. And I believe you're going to be talking a bit more, following on from Barb talking about the practical implementation of some of this as well. And just
yeah.
really inspiring to see the work you're doing in the workshops. I think we're all taking some lessons away from those. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Barb and Kath, for those wonderful presentations before this. I was invited by Barb to participate in this because I actually used her articles in my courses this semester towards the end. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I structured that and what came about from those discussions, obviously fairly anonymously. I just want to introduce myself really quick and just let you all know that I'm coming from the homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, as well as the lands of the Genízaro community of Cornwall, which is an Hispanicized indigenous community that was previously enslaved by the Spanish outside of Albuquerque. I'm an early career professional, and I work in a minority serving institution that's primarily Hispanic and Native American serving. We're hugely first gen, and this becomes I think quite important, as well as 60% non-trad students. So we're kind of a flip of a lot of more kind of traditional models of upper academia. And we also have an open enrollment, right? So there's a lot of challenges that come with this, but we also end up having the highest social mobility impacts on our students as well. But we have students with really oftentimes challenging and diverse backgrounds that they're bringing into very effectively and productively into particularly into anthropology and archaeology. Positionally, I'm a white, cisgendered, straight identifying male. I'm neurodiverse. I'm a first-gen student, non-traditional also, which is helps me work with a lot of the older students that we have. And I come from a working class background. You know, speaking in terms of everything that Barb and Kath have introduced so far, and I've definitely participated in a lot of the surveys that have gone out. I've experienced harassment of all types, right? Obviously, I have a lot of privilege in my positions, but I've particularly experienced sexual harassment and unwanted sexual contact in my previous careers. Archaeology is essentially my second or third potentially career at this point. And it's been a lot of I've been lucky enough not to have that happen to me within archaeology, but I've definitely been able to kind of take some of those experiences to help me, I think, be a better mentor for my students who are running into some of these really significant emotional and career roadblocks that are resulting from this. One of the things that I've noticed while talking to friends and colleagues and students is that who've been discussing their sexual harassment and assault and unwanted sexual contact issues within the field, both in the field within the university setting. And I have previously worked in commercial archaeology, both in private and for the federal government, as well as nonprofit. And it's prevalent in all of these areas, and in some ways differently, because the nature of the distribution of power is slightly different, but it's hugely prominent in the United States, at least within federal employment. We had a recent much needed interventions, public interventions in the National Park Service, because the same reasons that it's problematic and prevalent in our field is, people are in these really remote, very hierarchical situations that essentially are enforced into a kind of powerless situation. But I've been really lucky in the academy to only have experienced, and this is sounds pretty horrible for us to say that we've only experienced certain types of harassment, but I've been lucky enough to have only experienced class and ableist harassment as an archaeologist. But pulling all these things together, we generally open up our discussions in my classrooms about this towards the end. This is primarily with upper division students. I usually teach my intro students about this towards the end of semesters, so they have if they do decide to switch majors or anything, they have a clear view of what they're walking into. And one of the things that we do when we're working in a discussion group with the advanced undergrad students and graduate students as well, I should add, is to not necessarily even get to the discussion of headlines, as Barb's colleague had eloquently put it, but to just talk about general patterns that folks have seen. So we try to keep it in a position where people can, if they feel comfortable, and most don't, discuss issues that have happened to them, but definitely discuss things at least a step removed, more anonymously, right? So one of the other things I do is teach a field school, and my teaching on harassment of all forms within archaeology, but specifically focusing on sexual harassment and assault, has been really oriented heavily towards the beginning of these field school situations, since so many of these contexts are quite problematic for that. So we really center the first week or so around discussing equitable practices and interactions in order to avoid harassment, and also talk about how to disrupt harassment situations, and then teach students how to disrupt those as well. So I'm going to jump into some of the stuff we did with Barb's articles this semester, and then some of the things that came out of it. And then I'm going to real quickly talk about some of the interventions that, and I've learned a lot from Barb's articles, from her presentation, and then from Kath's presentation as well, that I'm going to definitely be introducing to the students to sort of expand and improve our discussions and our ability to manage these situations, clearly not at the systemic level or at the systems level, but hopefully intersecting at the systems level. And we talk about our field school oftentimes as this kind of space, what anarchists talk about as temporary autonomous zones, is trying to make it these places where people can actually step outside of the insanity of the modern state and actually work within an environment that feels safe, sometimes for the first time for folks. And obviously we try very hard to make that happen. And it's always a continuing process instead of, I think, a destination. But when we were talking about harassment towards the close of the semester with my, when my undergrad and graduate students and I were talking about that, we used Barb's recent publications to structure the conversation. And there's actually three. There's a blog post, which I think wasn't posted in the chat as well. And I actually had my undergrads read the blog post, and then my grad students read the articles to help bring everyone a bit to the same page. But we focused on the two articles, and this was really helpful because it actually follows in, I think, different steps from previous work that I've tried to do to implement equitability work within the classroom to avoid and to address harassment related issues. And I also should highlight, similar to what Barb had mentioned, is that I tell the students that I'm required to report any sexual harassment and assault related issues. And sadly, this is something that actually happened this year, not because of something that came out of this conversation, but I think it sounds like maybe Kath has been involved with this last semester as well. It's been an ongoing semester. And I think anyone who teaches about this, really anyone who's in the academy or in any institution, one of the first things I tell my students is that all of the folks that they're going to run into, maybe that's an over problematic stereotype, but the vast majority of people they're going to run into in these situations who are supposed to be their advocates are actually advocating for the institution and not necessarily for them for themselves. And so I try to set myself up as, luckily I have a union, so I can kind of be, forgive my French, an ass about it. So without getting immediately fired, since I'm not tenured yet. So I try to set myself up as someone who's a student advocate instead of an institutional advocate. But for Barb's articles, the students and I found the first one particularly helpful as an aggregator of a lot of the recent research that has happened over the last decade or so on harassment in archaeology and more broadly in anthropology. Barb mentioned Doug Rocks McQueen, who I was lucky enough to go to undergrad with actually. And Doug's, I think one of the great things about some of the work that's happening on this is that it's much more accessible. It's not behind paywalls. And thank you, Barb, for making that happen with your articles. But a lot of it is, right? And so some of the work with folks who are blogging has been particularly important for this as well. But once we actually had this sort of aggregate of information, then we used Barb's second article as essentially our tool set to start talking through particular ways that we see this come about, as well as ways that we can disrupt it. And so within Barb's second article on disrupting harassment, she talks about normalization, exclusionary practices, fraternization, gatekeeping, and obstacles to reporting. And there's a wide spectrum of folks within these conversations in terms of how they have had sexual harassment, sexual assault impact them, or if they've had that impact them, or even in sometimes if they've even recognized it happening to them. And I think particularly coming from a masculine perspective, sometimes we don't always recognize that, especially coming from other men as well. But one of the main things that came out of these discussions within the classrooms, and this happened within the two courses that I was teaching this in, particularly with the second article, was that students were actually surprised to recognize how much of these kind of practices, these normalization issues, exclusionary practices, fraternization and gatekeeping in particular, were actually present within their student careers and their personal lives outside of their goals to get into this profession. And then also how much of it seems to be happening in non-sexual contexts as well. And this is not a direction that I try to take these conversations, because I try to center sexual harassment and sexual assault in them. But a lot of students are finding lessons from this and finding parallels in their lives that I think are still being quite helpful within just a broader spectrum of harassment and power inequalities. So we talked a lot about these particular practices, about how to disrupt the normalization of sexual harassment and how to recognize and disrupt exclusionary practices, right? How whisper networks create exclusionary practices, but can also disrupt exclusionary practices. So we tried to get some nuance within this and not look at this in a very black and white situation. And of course, this is just like 2 class periods, right? So we weren't able to solve all the world's problems, even close to that. Excuse me. So the end goal for this, or the end, I think, kind of result from this, and I'm going to try to wrap up here pretty quickly, was that in a format that I had already, or in a kind of a class context that had already been implementing, both for field school students as well as for my upper level undergraduate and graduate students. I've got MA students. Barb's article sort of came at exactly the right time. They came out like a week before these classes were happening. And so they really helped sort of reorganize how I do this. I have I've got some executive function issues. And so organization isn't always the key thing that makes things work and flow for me. But Barb's article really helped these paths that we needed to walk within the classroom verbally with the students. And I think, looking towards the future for this, I'm obviously still going to be using these, but I'm going to integrate them in some of the other kind of interventions, both what Barb talks about, particularly in her second article, and the communities of care is something that's really important within an anarchist tradition, which I actually come from. And one of the things that we talk about a lot within there is also looking at damage as a positive, and not saying that we should get damaged, but not trying to erase it, right? Seeing that as like a center of power for us as well. And so the kind of conversation or dialogue between these two positions has been really important, I think, in my field school settings in particular. So I'm going to share a couple links in the chat window. I'm a member of the Black Trowel Collective, and we've had a couple of interventions now in a couple different ways in terms of harassment. And so I'm going to share something that we put together, a few of us, called the Running Safer Sessions info sheet. And that's actually talking about how to both organize a session to avoid public incidences of harassment, as well as how to disrupt those and intervene when they happen safely. And I think this is one of the most important things, is a lot of people don't feel safe intervening in these kind of contexts. So thank you again for inviting me, and I'll add those.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lewis. I'll do the clap, and everyone's doing the hand emojis as well. So thank you so much. I think what I will do is I'll stop the recording at this point.